This is Hobby Talks, a podcast series exploring politics and policy-focused conversations with experts, scholars, and those guiding the most complex issues facing our region and state. This podcast is a production from the Hobby School of Public Affairs in partnership with the Center for Student Media at the University of Houston. In this episode, Hobby Talks host Jim Granado discusses the state of Congress, reflecting on its history and today's leadership-driven institution with political scientist Philip Wallach.
Welcome to Hobby Talks. I'm your host, Jim Granado, Dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. In this episode, I'm joined by political scientist Dr. Philip Wallach to discuss the state of Congress and our government's ability to work through deep divides. Dr. Wallach is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies America's separation of powers. He's the author of Why Congress, a book on the necessity of a thriving Congress and how it can reassert its relevance. Before joining AEI, he was a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, a nonprofit think tank focused on researching policy and governance. And by the way, AEI and Brookings, I believe, in Washington are right across the street from each other. I mean, these are two premier and foundational think tanks in Washington, D.C. Okay, I'd like to start now. First, before we unpack today's challenges, can you walk our listeners through Congress's job as the founders intended and how it has performed that job differently throughout history? So it's an easy question.
Sure. Well, representative government and representative legislatures were at the heart of America's founding. The founding generation was familiar with generations of colonial legislators who they felt did a better job of capturing what American colonists actually needed than the parliament across the ocean. And ultimately, they decided that that parliament was never going to be representative of them, and they needed to start this new country where their own legislatures would have pride of place. So from the very beginning, America's constitutional order has been legislature-centric, and the founders expected legislatures to be the place where we worked out what it is we want to do together. What are the common projects that we should take on, and how should we do it? That was sort of second nature to them. It's not something they thought very hard about, but it was a definitely the reigning assumption. And the Constitution itself was set up in part as a reaction against the Articles of Confederation, where executive powers were too feeble. So in framing the Constitution in Philadelphia in 1787, the framers were looking to make a stronger presidency because they didn't just want the Congress to do everything. The Congress under the Articles of Confederation was running departments. That was part of its job, and it wasn't going all that well. So separating out the executive function was important to them. But again, they always just expected the Congress would be the place where you make the big decisions. And so they assigned all of the most important powers of government to the Congress. And I think in many ways they probably didn't quite foresee just how many advantages the president would have just by being one compared to many. They expected the manyness of Congress to be an asset in some ways, and it has been throughout its history. The fact that America's diversity is represented by the many members of our House and Senate means that there's a certain legitimacy to the solutions they can work out together. But at the same time, I think it's fair to say that there are disadvantages to try to work things out with a group of hundreds of people as opposed to having one person make decisions. And so I'd say it's a very long trend over American history that more and more decision-making power has migrated into the executive branch and to the presidency in particular. And that's largely because Congress has decided to make it that way. Especially over the course of the 20th century, Congress delegated a lot of its powers to the executive branch because it thought doing so was a better way to get good policy often. So it's not a cynical story of members of the legislature trying to get out of their responsibility for no good reason. They thought that making the president the clear leader in national security was a good idea. They thought that making independent regulatory agencies the clear sort of frontline policymakers would lead us to have better policies. And so over time, Congress has given away a lot of its authority, and it did so for a lot of good reasons. But I think we now find ourselves in the 21st century in a situation where Congress has risked irrelevance or marginality. Because now the executive branch has become so aggressive in saying we have so many legal authorities at our command that we can do just about anything we need without going back through Congress. I guess the exception very much in the news these days is tax law. Congress is still presumed to be the only ones who can change the tax code, and that's very important. But so much of it, the rest of our policy making in the 21st century almost starts with the assumption that, oh, well, probably the president can do something about that, given the existing legal authorities at hand, and maybe the Congress can be persuaded to come along, or maybe not. Maybe we'll work around Congress rather than through it. And so today the Congress is really sort of struggling to defend its constitutional prerogatives.
So there is a referee between the presidency and the president and Congress, and that's the Supreme Court. And if you look at the evolution, the turning points in history, so going back to the 1800s, my recollection is that Lincoln did try to assert, in terms of war powers, I mean, you had the blockade. I believe that he did not seek congressional authorization. They had the prize cases, and I think he won in that case, I believe, unless I'm wrong. But
well, remember that the Congress was not a continuously sitting body
Right.
for most of American history, right? And that changed somewhere in the 20th century. But when Lincoln was inaugurated and the Civil War began, Congress was not in session.
Right.
And so he did eventually call it into a special session, but that wasn't until July of 1861. So he did an awful lot in those early months of the war on his own authority, sort of assuming that Congress would back him up retroactively, which mostly it did. There's a lot of ways in which Congress had to give the executive branch the ability to act in its physical absence back in the days when getting members to Washington was a lot harder than it became in the age of air travel. I do think Lincoln is an icon of the president sort of realizing how much he can do, taking the lead. But the Civil War Congress did an awful lot of stuff that Lincoln was really coming along with without much of his own initiative. So it cuts both ways.
And if you look at I would think another turning point is the 1930s. Again, an emergency. The Roosevelt administration asserts enormous amount of authority, right? And so the question is, the Supreme Court eventually, I think, after the court packing threat, they started to give the president more authority in terms of the regulatory agencies that he was trying to create. Now, was he getting congressional approval to do those things, or was he just creating it on his own?
There's that when you go back and look at the New Deal, Congress was very much subordinating itself to the president, but it was doing so by passing the laws that folks in the executive branch were actually writing. And it was passing them without a whole lot of deliberation in some cases. But they were still passing laws. Nobody doubted that the way to go forward was passing laws and creating new agencies and such. So that, when you see all these talks about what did Trump's 100 days look like compared to FDR, well, they look completely different because Trump, the second Trump administration's 100 days, which were extraordinarily active, almost exclusively involved doing things by executive fiat. And he could accomplish quite a few things that way, but it's quite different than changing the U.S. code, permanently setting up bodies that aren't going to go anywhere, no matter what the next president thinks about them. It's a different. The Supreme Court you mentioned as the arbiter. I think To some extent, that's fair. Separation of powers disputes do end up in court quite a lot. I would put a cautionary word in though about Congress depending on the Supreme Court to vindicate its own interests. Like ultimately, the separation of powers depends on each branch having its own ambitions and standing up for its own prerogatives. And so I think to a large extent, legislators today are out of the habit of doing that, and they hope the court will make their own lives easier by sort of deciding the proper scope of executive authority and the proper contours of the Congress executive relationship. But I think they ought not depend so much on the judges. It's really up to them. They have the tools to control the executive branch at their disposal, if only they'll use them.
Right. And I mean, I remember in the 70s, I'm old enough to remember this. I remember Gerald Ford, who was president, he said there was a book called The Imperial Presidency. I think it was written by Arthur Schlesinger. And anyway, but Ford says we don't have an imperial president, we have an imperial presidency because when he became the president, that was in the aftermath of the War Powers Act and then the Budget Empowerment Act. So there's two situations where Congress reasserted its authority. And those, I think both of those things are now could be challenged by the Trump administration, right? I mean, you're looking at the rescissions they're trying to make. And in addition, with what's happening in the Middle East, we've had issues like this before with Lebanon in the early 80s, where the Congress did get President Reagan to pull back and they gave him a time limit. But do you see that possibility happening where Congress could reassert, or is it just because the majority in both houses is Republican? But in addition, I think you're saying something's deeper, that it's cultural, that the people in Congress now aren't like they used to be about asserting their authority.
Yeah, you're right to bring up the 70s. The Nixon administration and the Johnson administration before it did some very aggressive things vis-a-vis Congress. And the legislators back then eventually really fought back. They were really responsible for chasing Nixon out of office. They would have impeached and convicted him. It was looking in 1974. That's why he resigned, and they reacted really quite strongly against his impoundments, and against some of his secret bombing in Cambodia. All of this led to Congress saying, kind of recoiling at how much they had been cut out of the loop and taking steps to put themselves back in the center of things. So that's building the Congressional Budget Office, trying to use the War Powers Act. Now, a lot of it, when we look back, that was a time of tremendous ferment and activity on Capitol Hill. A lot of the long-term trajectories of their reforms don't look so impressive, right? The War Powers Act has never been really such a great success at cabining the president's power. We have not, in fact, gone back to a situation where Congress has to declare wars in order for the United States to get involved in foreign foreign conflicts. And one of the most remarkable things about the Iran debate playing out right now, whether the United States should get involved directly with military conflict with Iran, is pretty much nobody thinks that this fight has to happen in Congress. I think members of Congress are important voices in the debate, but ultimately everyone just assumes it's the president's decision. And, the War Powers Act, some people bring up as a kind of footnote, but it doesn't seem like it's really effectively structuring the expectations. That's just where we are. President Obama got involved in Libya, without going through Congress. So it's not just a Republican thing either. Now, on the spending front, the rescissions that you mentioned are actually a feature of the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Right? Rescissions did not exist as a formal tool before that act, and so they're meant to be a way for presidents to go to Congress. And we've seen that with this $9 billion rescissions package that the president has sent over to Capitol Hill this year. So there's nothing constitutionally troubling about that. But the question is whether the Trump administration is going to do a whole bunch of other less sort of legally kosher things in terms of stopping spending just because they want to. That won't go through Congress, but will just basically say we don't care what Congress thinks. And so the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vogt, has pretty clearly and repeatedly said that he wants to pick this fight, that he thinks Congress basically isn't a responsible body, and so the executive branch has to show its own sense of responsibility through withholding spending that is unwise. That's still a fight that's sort of waiting to come to its fullest expression. The end of the fiscal year in September will tell us a lot about how that's going to play out.
Still, I'm focusing a little bit more on the historical part, historical evolution of congressional behavior. What was the high point of its power and effectiveness in your mind?
Well, I think there's a lot of moments in American history where you could say Congress was effective at being clearly the center of American political life. When you think about some of the decades before the American Civil War, you have these three figures in the Senate, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun, who were the giants of America's political life, and they were senators who never became president. All three of them tried and failed. There back in that time, the sort of sense that the debates that happened in the Capitol were the real action of American politics was really striking. And actually giving long speeches was really an important medium of communication and of thinking through our problems and deciding. I think that's never quite been matched in later American history, but in the mid 20th century, I think again there was a sense that the Congress was a really important place, and part of that was the way that the Democratic Party worked. The Democratic Party was the governing party for much of the mid 20th century, right? It was a strange coalition compared to what younger folks today are used to, because it was an ideologically diverse coalition where most of the most conservative people in the country were from the South, and they were Democrats by default. And then you had a sort of diverse bunch of Northern liberals as well. And so the Democratic Party worked itself out in Congress, and the chairmen in Congress were the most powerful people in deciding how American government would shape up. And so I admit to a certain nostalgia for that bygone era. I do think it's fair to ask how much the sort of demands of America as the world leader have forced things into the executive branch. That certainly was clear when Arthur Schlesinger wrote The Imperial Presidency, right? This sense that somehow America as empire was bound to push things more onto the presidency. I think that's been the case in the half century since he wrote that book, and very much still the case today. But I do have the sense that even in the last 30 years, Congress has lost a lot of ground, and that as it's become a more strictly partisan institution, sort of some of what made it special as a standalone branch of government has faded.
So there was an article in March in New Yorker. You asserted that in that article, you quoted numerous times that Congress was designed to mediate factional conflicts, but instead has contributed to them. How can we return to facilitating bipartisan deal making? Because I can recall even in the 80s, you had Southern Democrats working with Ronald Reagan on tax and spending legislation. They were called the boll weevils back then. And then the opposition was the Gypsy Moths, a group of Northeastern liberal Republicans. But even with You even had a Democratic member of the House who put in the piece of legislation on the Ways and Means Committee that dropped the top rate from 70% to 50%. William Broadhead did that, and that was a Democrat that did that. So you wouldn't see that today. So what's happened, and what are your thoughts on that?
Well, back in 1980 or so, Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill famously said all politics is local, right? And that was the truism back then. And it was probably fading a little bit even as he said it. But, 45 years on from that, it's just not true anymore. We have a lot of good empirical evidence showing that even state legislature races or local city council races are overwhelmingly dominated by national trends, where what people really want to vote for is a letter by someone's name, R or D. And so we've nationalized politics, and we've, at least for a lot of purposes, ideologically sorted American politics so that, basically you think everything runs along right and left. Whether the words liberal conservative make sense anymore is a different question. But you're left on everything or right on everything. And yes, there are people in the middle, but it's all pretty much tidy. If you're left, you're Democrat. If you're right, you're Republican. And as a result of that sorting out and nationalization, people mostly feel like the only really important election that we have is who we put in the White House. So much is going through the White House, and the White House clearly has the opportunity to enact so much of the left or right agenda. And so it seems logical to subordinate just about every other goal to this overriding goal of securing the White House. And I think a lot of members of Congress have just reconciled themselves to that idea that, yes, they may have priorities that come from their home constituents, and they'll try to do their best to advance those. But at the end of the day, that priority just isn't as important as being a good foot soldier for the party and making sure they do everything they can to help their party win at the next quadrennial presidential election. And if that's the mindset, then the way we do politics today makes a good amount of sense. The only problem, of course, is that we go completely crazy over all these presidential elections. They bear so much weight that everyone feels that they're the end of the world. And it's not quite clear whether you can have a republic that functions in this way. You start thinking about the ways you can use power to punish your enemies and maintain your hold on power, which is not a healthy dynamic, but it's one that sort of makes sense within the logic of the system we've accepted. A system that allows for more slack and more taking each issue as it comes and seeing how actually maybe left and right don't apply to every issue, and maybe we can find ways of working through quite a lot of problems in ways that don't map onto party. That's a system where people can take a deep breath a little more and say, well, maybe the only thing that matters isn't whether my party controls the White House, but it actually matters quite a great deal if I have a member in Congress who I trust, and that person gets their seat at the table. So I think we have to figure out a way to step out of this bad equilibrium we're in. It's not easy, because for any one person, just saying you'd like out isn't good enough. But I do think part of the question is whether these two parties are actually doing a good job, having a sense of what's important to the American people and actually creating a policy agenda that the American people feels like serves them. It doesn't seem like either one of them has managed to take power and convert it into a 55 or 60% base of support, right? Instead, you sort of see both parties finding ways to limit their own support in some ways. And so I guess it gives me a bit of hope to think that there are possibilities for seeking out political support through a more kind of exploratory, decentralized legislative approach that are there and that are possibly waiting to be realized. But I've been hoping that we kind of snap out of it for a while now, and it doesn't mostly happen. The people whose job it is to sort of maintain this hard dichotomy, this hard kind of Manichaean opposition, are good at what they do. And most Americans who care about politics end up just feeling like one party is good and the other party is very evil and threatening. And yeah, getting out of that sort of downward spiral is a hard trick to pull off.
In the Senate, John Thune is the majority leader. And he's had a reputation for working in good faith with Democrats on the committees he sat on. And the article basically does go through, this New York article you were quoted in, goes through contrast between Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, and him. Do you see him as he's going to have enormous pressure from his own party, and particularly President Trump. And the article mentions they've had some frank conversations, but do you see John Thune as being someone that could actually thread this needle, maybe make some inroads to build more bridges with, one area for sure is the filibuster. If he holds strong and opposes any attempt to eliminate that, that's a point in his favor with the opposition. But do you see it in any other legislation at this point, or anything?
There's a lot of subtle points to how Thune will lead the Senate. I do think he's strongly committed to maintaining the legislative filibuster, but he's also shown a willingness to kind of nibble away at it through creating larger exceptions to what can be filibustered. So, that's an interesting dynamic to watch. But listen, I do think he's an interesting character. He does not owe his job to Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump clearly weighed into the Senate leadership contest after Mitch McConnell announced that he would be stepping down from this leader of Senate Republicans. Donald Republicans' candidate was Rick Scott, who got 13 votes. And it was largely a contest between Thune and John Cornyn of Texas, and Thune won. And Thune is his own man. And what I really liked about that New Yorker article was what an interesting portrait it painted of sort of where he came from, where his values come from. He's a small town South Dakota guy who clearly just has a very different constellation of values than the president. And so I think watching him try to navigate the pressures of staying on the president's good side without simply giving up all of the Senate's prerogatives is a very interesting one. I'm hopeful in some ways, but he avoided fights on the nominations, right? He just clearly made a strategic decision. We're just gonna not use any of our ammo stopping president's nominations, and that's having certain consequences for sure right now. It may have been a wise strategic decision, but the question is sort of where are the fights you're willing to have? And I'm not saying they all have to spill out onto the front page. Maybe it's better for him to fights quietly. But yeah, I do think there's so much focus on the one big beautiful bill, right? It's a lot of dimensions there. The senators are having their say. I think one area to look at is the budget process and whether Congress manages to steer that anymore. We had a full year continuing resolution last year. That's pretty much Congress throwing up its hands and saying, sorry, we can't do the job. In my view, if we were to have another full year continuing resolution, that would be really abject. But you have to find a way through, and probably that means getting bipartisan support. And, that's an interesting dynamic to watch as well. In the Joe Biden presidency, especially in the first 2 years, there were quite a few deals made with Senate Republicans who were then in the minority. They managed to pass quite a few bills with strong bipartisan support. The Trump administration so far, the second Trump administration, has shown very little interest in doing that. So one question is just, do we see a reemergence of bipartisanship? Because if you're keeping the filibuster, it's really the only way to make Congress do important things. Or do you just see the Trump administration saying more and more, we don't need Congress. Congress is a hindrance. We will find ways of doing without.
One thing that was interesting, and I'd like to know what you think about this, with the continuing or the debts or the government shutdown that was avoided, Chuck Schumer was pivotal in that happening. Was there something behind the scenes that led to that? Because that was, in some sense, bipartisan. Or am I wrong about that?
Well, sure. I mean, at some level, they had spending levels set under Joe Biden, and a bipartisan agreement made in 2024, and they just decided to keep that in place. So in some ways that has to look like a win for Democrats, and Schumer saying, well, we're not going to fight and try to get a better deal than that, makes a lot of sense. But then again, a lot of folks on the left were very angry at any willingness to cooperate with this administration and not use the spending bill as an opportunity to try to slow down some of what it was doing through executive action. So again, Schumer decided that wasn't the right moment to fight. I thought he was correct on that. I didn't think that really he had a very good position to fight from. But again, when's the moment going to come?
So with the tax bill, the big, beautiful bill, passed the House by one vote. And one of the points of contention was the state and local tax deduction. And the House, what I understand about the House bill is they've got more extensive cuts in Medicare, but I think they've also trimmed the state and local tax deduction. The Senate has. So the question is going to be, if that's voted out in the Senate, it's not just bipartisanship. You've got Republicans in the House. There's some that won't vote for unless the SALT, the reductions are.
The whole approach on this one big beautiful bill is completely partisan. They've not really done anything to look for Democratic votes at all. They've gone under the assumption that, well, Biden did his Inflation Reduction Act as a all Democrat reconciliation bill. We're going to do this important legislation as an all Republican reconciliation bill. And that's going to be hard. They'll probably figure out a way to do it just because it would be so disastrous for them to fail at this point. So I wouldn't bet against them doing it, but it's quite a lot of work to get to the finish line still. In the House, you have these California and New York Republicans without whom they would not have the majority, who say, listen, to serve our constituents, we need to increase the state and local tax deduction. And we just won't go back and try to contest the 2026 midterms unless we can do that. They've been pretty clear in making their demands, and they have a clear political case for doing it, right? And you have some spending hawks, both in the House and in the Senate, saying, how can our party, who's claimed to want to cut federal spending, come in and actually not do very much in cutting federal spending in this big, beautiful bill? How are we actually coming in and making the deficit worse? We need to cut more. You have some fights over the specifics of Medicaid, where really there are some strong divides within the party. You have to work through all of those. So it's going to take some real finesse for the Republican leadership to be able to get enough members, and a lot of both carrots and sticks from the White House probably also. But they kind of have to get it done. So they'll have to find the way through, I think, and that would be my expectation. Whether they can do it by July 4th or August. And meanwhile, the debt ceiling does come in as as something that has to be dealt with along the way at some point.
So this is a tricky question. I mean, in terms of productivity, how do we measure that? But would you argue that as the presidents become more dominant, has the productivity of Congress shrunk in terms of, I mean, I guess it's so subjective. Once you could say the number of bills passed, but then you could say, well, some are very significant and some aren't. So how many significant bills were passed? But is it your sense that in terms of productivity, however you want to define it, have things gotten, in the sense of activity, lower than it used to be?
Yeah. Well, in terms of number of bills passed, that's an easy thing to see, and it has gone down, down, down for a while now. But in large part, that's because they passed larger clumps of statute altogether, right? We've seen a trend toward omnibus legislation. And so in terms of pages of output that get passed into law every year, it's much less of a clear trend. We can say the previous Congress, the 118th, was very unproductive. Really did not have a very productive session. And there might be reasons to worry about this trend toward omnibuses, fewer laws with more things stuffed into them. They, at some point, kind of make it harder to see the action on any one issue, harder to do good legislative deliberation on any given issue. Instead, it's sort of a matter of what can you get the leadership to shove in there and make everyone feel is in this must-pass bill. That's the sort of dynamic we've seen. I think it's not a very healthy way of proceeding, but we've seen both parties adopt this very leadership-heavy style, where it's much less based on the committees. It's much more based on going through the top partisan leaders who are going to be the ones to make those big deals that often get passed in December. So that's where we are in terms of overall productivity. I do have also the sense that Congress just seems like a less central actor on an awful lot of policymaking areas, right? Where it may debate about an issue, but nobody really thinks it's going to pass a bill. Like take immigration, one of the issues most central to our politics. It's certainly the Congress has taken up ambitious legislation at various points in the 21st century, but it's never passed basically an important immigration statute over the last few decades, and it's almost like we've kind of given up hope that would be really something that would happen. We tried to frame a border security bill after the Biden administration kind of decided that it had misplayed that issue in 2024, and you saw Republicans just frankly say, we don't really want to do legislation working with the other party because that's a sucker's game, because the other party's president will do bad things with the law. So we'll just go ahead and fight the presidential election and see if we can get our guy in. And sure enough, President Trump in his second inaugural address said, some people thought we needed a new law. It turned out what we needed was a new president. That's where an awful lot of people's thinking is today. And if you're a legislator who fundamentally doesn't really believe in legislating, where does that leave you?
In terms of, you've diagnosed the problem. What are some of the reforms you'd like to see take place that would help Congress to rebalance things in your mind?
I'd like to see the committees made more important again. I think a structure that privileges committee work is a structure that can privilege people who actually care about the issues and learn about the particulars. And that kind of thinking is naturally more conducive to compromise and doing good work in the legislature. It's not an all or nothing approach. So there are some formal rules changes that we could adopt that would make committees more powerful. Part of the problem today is committees can work really hard on legislation only to have it go nowhere. It just sort of sits with the leadership, and they say, "Oh yes, we'll make this, and we just need to make this and this change, and then we'll get it up for a vote." But really, the strategy is just to ride things out and not do anything on an awful lot of cases. So, getting committees more able to force their own work onto the floor for a vote is high on my list of priorities of reforms we could make that would change the incentives for legislators. Because if you know that the committees you're on are important, you can invest time in that causes you to build relationships with your counterparts on the other party. On the other hand, if you think that all your committee work is just going nowhere, better to invest in your social media efforts and just sort of becoming an outsized celebrity in ways that don't really have anything to do with being a policymaker.
I'd like to drill down the committee structure. I think in the 70s there was some reforms in committee membership. I believe seniority was the rule back then, and then that was removed. Would you see, and I don't know what it is today, has it gone back where seniority matters again, or is it, the question I have for you is it more effective to have the old hands that are there who could become tyrants at some point, or to have it open where people that it's based, I hate to use this word, merit, that is, people that are respected, get put, and they're experts on those committees? Because we've had both. Do you see one being better than the other?
There's clearly advantages to both systems. Seniority was basically sacrosanct for most of the mid-20th century. And that meant that those committee chairmen became barons, right? They were very powerful people. And eventually that system got overthrown because those barons were so offensive to a new sort of liberal surging power, right? There were a lot of old Southern bulls, they were called, and they got toppled for a reason. Now that, so we live in a system now where seniority is important, but it's nowhere near sacrosanct. And ultimately, the leadership says a lot about who gets to become chairman and hold on to their chairmanships. And that means ultimately the leadership has the upper hand in those relationships. So I would like to find ways of making the chairman stronger. That does mean sometimes people will use their chairmanships to do bad things. Oh well, that's part of what goes with making people powerful. The Republicans in the House have a term limit on their own chairman right now. You can only serve 6 years as the leader of Republicans on any given committee. That's, in my view, self-harming, in that it actually makes Democrats relatively stronger by having chairmen who can serve longer and sort of improve their knowledge and skills related to that committee. So I also just think it's bad for the institution. It makes some members leave after they get term limited out of their committees who were really strong members. So I would favor changing that. That's part of the Republican conference rules that they would have to change themselves. More generally, yeah, if I could flip a switch and make it a seniority system, I probably would do it. The merit you talk about, that's the principle for selection these days, often just has to do with fundraising prowess. And that's an important skill, but it's not the one I would want to be dictating who gets to be the top policymaker on any given issue.
Hey, yeah, because what brings up the merit issue is someone like Kevin Brady. I mean, he's very well respected. I mean, he's from this area, from Houston. He's north of Houston, but his expertise. I mean, he was fairly senior, but I'm not sure he was the most senior. But I mean, his ability to work with people, working with President Trump, for example. I mean, it was things like that. But again, it's probably the experience is going to matter. So yes. Well, one final question for you. Is there something that I didn't ask that you would like to bring up?
This isn't exactly about Congress only, but I would just like to take one more pass at this issue of if we assume the president gets to do everything, where does that leave us? And I want to do it with reference to something that's in the news right now, the TikTok law. So I said that the 118th Congress was very, very unproductive in general. One of the interesting success stories in that Congress was this TikTok law, where a bipartisan group of legislators in the House figured out a way of putting this bill together and running the gauntlet before TikTok's lobbyists could stop it, and working with the leadership and getting this passed into law with strong bipartisan support. So this law says that unless TikTok could have its Chinese ownership stake divested within a certain period of time, it would need to no longer be legal to offer it on the app stores of Apple and Google. That's the enforcement mechanism they settled on. And that date came and went, and President Trump came in after winning in 2024 and coming in January 2025 and said, "Okay, I'm putting in an extension of the law." And it was kind of unclear whether he had the authority to do that, but okay, it sort of seemed like maybe he did once. And then he came in and said, "I'm putting in another extension." And now this week he came in and said, "I'm putting in a third and longer extension." What is the basis for this extension? Kind of scare quotes, national security, invoke those words, and somehow the president has the power not to do what the law clearly says he must, that the executive branch must do. And instead, indeed, the attorney general told Apple and Google, "Put this back on your app stores. We will promise not to prosecute you. We will protect you legally. We do not want you to follow this law. We think it's better not to." And that's quite a thing if laws become optional. Now, it doesn't come from nowhere. Arguably, what President Obama did with DACA, the Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, this huge non-prosecution policy that created this special class of immigrants, that kind of set the stage. And we've seen presidents of both parties sort of more and more looking like laws are optional. And that leaves us in a really scary place for just how we make our legal system function. It's a bigger problem than just Congress. It's really, if you have a bunch of optional laws, then everything is a matter of discretion, and everything is a matter of who the people who control the levers of power want to favor. And just from a standpoint of like, is this a country where it's a good place to run a business? Is this a country where you can plan endeavors that take many decades to play out because you can depend on what the law means? It's very frightening to see the law becoming an optional thing. And again, it would be a solution to sort of assure that more things went through Congress and then ended up in statutes that just settled issues. But in this case, we have a statute.
Right.
And we see an administration saying, well, that doesn't even matter. And it's not clear who has standing to challenge that. So it's not clear that courts can ride in and save the day. So we really, from a rule of law standpoint, are coming to maybe a crisis point that we need to realize is here, and that you can't just shrug away because you're not passionate about the particular issue. Maybe the TikTok law was a mistake. If that's the case, we should repeal it.
Right.
Anyway, that's very much at the top of my mind these days.
I mean, the point about the rule of law that's quite stark, actually, because we depend on that for a market to work. I mean, you have to have a sense that contracts are there, laws enforceable. There's some assurance that the rewards will be there, and you can delay gratification and engage in these agreements. And if it becomes what you say, continues. I mean, there's no stability, there's no certainty, there's no engagement.
I mean, the kind of engagement you need in that point is all through the back channels with the administration. It becomes akin to these 17th century royal courts,
Yes.
where, getting the monarch on your side is all that really matters. And so you better find your roots of influence that way. And, that's what we're not supposed to be in America. We're not supposed to have this sort of kingly discretion. We're supposed to be a nation of laws. And the only way that works is if we, as a collective, follow the laws and treat them like they really matter.
Your point here is this, it's so fundamental. We're on our way to mercantilism if we continue. This is what you're saying. Well, Dr. Philip Wallach, thank you for your insightful conversation, for being our guest on the Hobby Talks. We'll return with a new season in the fall. Visit our website and social media platforms for information on Hobby Talks programming. Again, Dr. Wallach, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. This podcast represents the views of the guests and not of the University of Houston. The Center for Student Media provided sound and engineering support, and Soundcast Music provided the podcast song. The series is produced by the Communications and Marketing team at the Hobby School of Public Affairs. For more information on Hobby Talks, including past and upcoming episodes, visit uh.edu/hobby/hobbytalks.